In 1985, the government of Dubai handed two men a desk, a telephone, and $10 million. No aircraft, no routes, no staff, and no real airport infrastructure to speak of. Just a small office, a startup budget, and an instruction that amounted to figure it out. At the time, Gulf Air was the dominant carrier in the region, with decades of experience and an established route network across the Middle East. The idea that a startup from a city most of the world had barely heard of would one day become the largest long-haul airline on the planet, reshaping how billions of people move between continents, was not a prediction anyone was making. That was about to change. 40 years before Emirates existed, Dubai was a small trading port on the Persian Gulf. The oil money transforming the broader Gulf region was flowing, but Dubai specifically had less oil than its neighbors and understood early that it could not build a future on reserves alone. The plan, even then, was to become a hub, a place where goods, money, and eventually people would move through on their way to somewhere else. The two men handed that desk were Maurice Flanagan, a veteran British airline executive, and a young Kenyan-born administrator named Tim Clark, who had been working in aviation planning for years. Neither had been asked to build something modest. They had been asked to build something that would serve Dubai's larger ambition. Their first flight operated in October 1985, with a leased Boeing 727 and a leased Airbus A300, two aircraft serving 5 routes. By every conventional measure, a minor regional carrier taking its first cautious steps. But here is the detail that everyone missed at the time. Emirates was structured differently from almost every state-linked airline ever created. It received startup capital from the Dubai government, but it was required from day one to operate without ongoing state subsidies, with no government backstop and no safety net. The airline had to be commercially viable on its own terms, or it had to stop. Clark did not arrive at this position without friction. In the early years, there were internal debates about whether Emirates should operate more like a traditional Gulf carrier, conservative on routes, cautious on fleet expansion, content to serve regional traffic. Clark kept pushing against that instinct. He wanted a different airline entirely, one that did not think about its geography as a limitation, but as its single greatest asset. That constraint, combined with Clark's vision, turned out to be the most important decision in the airline's history. Carriers in the region that operated with government backstops developed a comfort that Emirates never had. Every route decision, every aircraft order, every operational choice had to justify itself commercially. And that discipline produced a management culture that subsidized competitors simply did not develop in the same way. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains the next 30 years. Dubai sits at a point on the map that is within roughly 8 hours of flying time from 2/3 of the world's population, covering Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Australia. Draw a circle with an 8-hour radius around Dubai International Airport, and the number of people inside it is extraordinary. No other major aviation hub sits at that intersection with the same geographic precision. London is too far west, Singapore is too far east, Hong Kong is close but tilted. Dubai sits almost exactly where the world's largest traffic flows converge. Clark understood this before almost anyone outside the airline did. The strategy he built around it was not the hub-and-spoke model that defined American and European aviation, where passengers are funneled through regional hubs and connected onward. It was something more aggressive. Fly as many people as possible through Dubai from as many origins as possible, connect them to as many destinations as possible, and use the sheer volume of connecting traffic to justify frequencies and routes that no point-to-point carrier could sustain alone. The strategy required one thing above everything else. The planes had to be large enough to carry the volume and efficient enough to make the economics work across the longest distances in commercial aviation. Emirates did not want medium jets on short hops. It wanted the largest wide-body aircraft available, flying the longest routes possible, filled as close to capacity as it could get them. That decision led Emirates directly toward the Boeing 777 in the 1990s, and what followed was one of the most sustained fleet expansions in commercial aviation history. Emirates placed its first 777 order when the aircraft was still relatively new to the market. United Airlines had launched the program, but Emirates turned it into something else entirely. Where other carriers used the 777 on select long-haul routes to complement existing networks, Emirates used it as the foundation of an entirely new operating model. Dubai to London, Dubai to Sydney, Dubai to Sao Paulo. Routes that connected continents through a single hub, generating connecting traffic volumes that made the economics work in ways they would not have for any other carrier. By the mid-2000s, Emirates was not just a major 777 customer. It was the aircraft's defining operator, the airline that had done more than any other to demonstrate what a large twin-engine widebody could achieve on ultra-long routes between a connecting hub and major cities across 3 continents. Boeing had built the plane. Emirates had proved what it was for, and that relationship, built over a decade of 777 operations, gave Clark a very specific idea about what he needed next. The Airbus A380 was announced in the late 1990s as the answer to a specific problem. Slot-constrained airports like London Heathrow could only accommodate a fixed number of aircraft movements per day. If you could not add more flights, the only way to move more passengers was to put more of them on each plane. A double-decker aircraft carrying 500 people was more efficient at a congested hub than 2 aircraft carrying 250 each. Carriers evaluating the A380 saw complexity, high operating costs, and an aircraft that only made economic sense on a handful of very high-density routes. Clark looked at the same airplane and saw his entire business model made physical. Emirates did not just buy the A380. Emirates became the A3. The airline ordered 123 of them, nearly half of every A380 ever built. Clark structured his entire long-haul strategy around the aircraft. Before the pandemic, Emirates publicly stated that roughly 80% of its profits came from A380 operations. I mean, think about that for a second. One aircraft type, 80% of profits. That is not a product preference, that is an airline that had fused its identity with a single machine. The relationship between Emirates and the A380 became so intertwined that Emirates flew the aircraft on routes where other carriers would never have considered it viable, proving that the economics worked at the volumes its connecting hub could generate. Other airlines watched, tried the A380 on a smaller scale, and found that without that volume, the numbers were much harder to justify. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. While Clark was publicly championing the A380 and privately pushing Airbus for a re-engined version with new generation turbofans, his airline was simultaneously placing an order that would define the next era of aviation. At the Dubai Airshow in November 2013, Emirates announced 2 orders in the same week: 50 more A380 aircraft with one hand and 150 Boeing 777X aircraft with the other. The 777's order alone was valued at roughly $76 billion at list price. Same airshow, same week. The airline that had built itself around the A380 was simultaneously funding the aircraft that would eventually replace it. If you are wondering how that makes sense as a strategy, so was everyone watching at the time. But Clark was not contradicting himself. He was doing something that very few executives in any industry have ever had the scale to do. He was using Emirates' order volume as leverage against both manufacturers simultaneously, by remaining the dominant A380 customer while becoming the largest 777X buyer. Emirates ensured that its preferences, its cabin configurations, its range requirements, and its delivery schedules would shape both programs. No other airline on Earth had that kind of influence over the companies building its fleet. And the consequences of that influence went beyond Emirates itself. When an airline with 200-plus aircraft on order from a single program expresses a preference about cabin layout, seat configuration, or range capability, the manufacturer listens, not out of courtesy, but out of commercial necessity. Emirates shaped the interior specifications of both the A380 and the 777X in ways that influenced what every other airline buying those aircraft eventually received. The first-class suite configurations that became industry standard on wide-body jets, the galley positioning, the door arrangements, all of it carries Emirates' fingerprints because Emirates was the customer whose volume made the programs viable. Other airlines, including some of the largest carriers in Europe and Asia, found themselves operating aircraft that had been optimized around a competitor's requirements. That is a level of market influence that goes well beyond simply buying a lot of planes. Clark spent years pushing Airbus for what he called the A380neo, a re-engined version with modern turbofans that he estimated would deliver 12 to 14% better fuel efficiency. He worked with Airbus engineers on the design and had detailed conversations with Rolls-Royce about engine options. He said publicly that they got very close. Airbus kept saying no. The reason connects to something uncomfortable about how the aviation industry actually works. An A380neo would have cost Airbus billions to develop for, in the most optimistic scenario, one committed buyer and perhaps two. And if it had succeeded, it would have competed directly with the A350, the Airbus wide-body that was actually generating returns. Airbus was not going to rescue an unprofitable program by cannibalizing a profitable one, regardless of how personally or persistently Clark pressed the case. This was the point where Emirates' entire strategy ran into a wall it could not move. The aircraft that Clark had built his airline around was going to end. Airbus delivered the final 80 in December 2021, 251 aircraft in total across 14 customers, and closed the production line. Emirates was left holding the largest fleet of a discontinued aircraft type in aviation history, with no direct replacement from the manufacturer, and a 7X program running 7 years behind its original delivery schedule. By the mid-2020s, Clark was publicly describing Emirates as a frustrated entity. The airline needed planes and could not get them fast enough. 777X delays, slower than expected A350 deliveries, and the lingering effects of the pandemic on fleet planning had left the airline that had shaped global aviation for 4 decades in a position it had never been in before. What Emirates did in response was characteristic. Rather than pulling back, it kept ordering. By 2025, the airline had placed additional 777X orders at successive Dubai Airshows, building its total commitment to 270 aircraft. It added A350 orders and 787 orders to bridge the gap, while waiting for the 777X to finally enter service. Clark also returned to Airbus with a proposal for a completely new double-decker design, a high-wing aircraft with 4 UltraFan engines and modern composite construction that he estimated would deliver 20 to 25% lower operating costs than the original A380. Airbus said no again. The pattern held. Emirates pushes for the aircraft it believes its strategy requires. The manufacturers decline. Emirates orders the next best available option in volumes large enough to shape how that option gets built. It is a negotiation conducted entirely through purchase agreements, and Emirates has been conducting it for 40 years without stopping. 2 men, a desk, and $10 million in 1985. By 2024, the world's largest fleet of wide-body aircraft, more international connecting passengers through a single hub than any competitor, and more than 270 orders for the 777X alongside 73 A350s and 35 787s. Emirates had not just survived. It had reshaped the economics of long-haul aviation, pushed 2 of the world's largest aircraft manufacturers to build programs around its requirements, and turned geographic position into the most powerful connecting hub in commercial aviation history. Clark built all of this, not by following models that existed, but by understanding something about geography and passenger flow that the established carriers had looked at and decided was not worth pursuing. Now you understand why every other major airline in the world is still trying to answer what Emirates figured out in 1985. And you understand why the aircraft Emirates actually needs, the one that would let it run that strategy for another 30 years, still does not exist.